I remember at Torrey Pines Golf Course, one of the premier golf courses and a public course in our country. Some reporters and I would play golf there regularly, but we never could get tee times in the morning. We couldn't figure out why, because we'd start calling for a reservation right on the moment that we could, and it was already full for the morning. And so during one afternoon when we finally got to play again, I went up to the starter, and the person who keeps time or keeps record of who's going off when, and I asked him if he kept records of who went off when for the last 3 months. And he said he did. So and this is one thing about FOI law and FOI cases, I asked him if he had a piece of paper, and he did. And so I stood there and wrote out an FOI request right there for the logs for the last 3 months, the starting logs. Well, he pulled them together in a couple of days. I went back, and lo and behold, believe it or not, it was the same groups at the same time on a public course, weekend after weekend. So they didn't even start until the afternoon. Anybody else had a chance to get in. So I wrote the story that the same group of people were taking these times every weekend. One of the things that I'd asked the starter at the time was, after I saw that, I said, well, do you know these people? And he said, well, yeah, I know the guys, I know. Have you become friends with them? Well, yeah, pretty. Do they ever give you gifts? You know, Christmas, do you get a little bottle of whatever you like best or something else? And he said, well, yeah, at Christmas they give us gifts. So to make a long story short, the story appeared in the Times, and within a week, the whole thing was completely switched around. Finally, people could get back on who wanted to play golf in the morning on a weekend, other than this group. And that just reinforced what I knew the whole time, that this law is so critical, because had I not had that, he would not have given me those records. And because I did, the whole system changed. And I credit the FOI law beyond myself for having that done. In another case in LA, a young man was murdered. I FOI'd the prosecutor's office for the records. It showed that they had gotten the case in their investigation completely wrong. And so I wrote that story, saying how this young man actually died rather than why they weren't filing charges because they thought it was an accident. Well, all of a sudden, within 2 days, they had to back up and file charges against this young man that killed him, and he was convicted and sentenced for involuntary manslaughter. From there, I went to Chicago. In Chicago, the way they play hardball, by the way, the system for sure in every way. I was reading about a young black man who had hanged himself, supposedly, in one of the police lockups. I think there were a dozen police lockups in Chicago. And he'd been running from the police, and they arrested him on some relatively minor charge, a misdemeanor. And the next day he was dead. He was 21 years old. So I wondered, how many of these deaths do they have in Chicago? And so I FOI'd that for the police department, asking how many they'd had in the last 2 years and which lockups. And it came back, and even I was amazed, because it was more than the combined total of New York and LA in that one community, that one city. So I wrote that story, and the next thing you know, other people are coming forward. And before it was over, the police department was having to call police commissioner was having to call a press conference and announce major reforms in the way they handled the people they arrested, especially young black men. And so the thing that happened with George Floyd obviously had been going on for a long time, everywhere, not just not just in Minnesota. The Dixon, Illinois housed the largest. I had 5,000 patients, developmentally disabled, sorry. And we heard that they'd been dropping their population, but we didn't understand why. So we went to Dixon and looked. I came back and wrote an FOI request to the state, and discovered in the process, because of that FOI request, that indeed the population had been dwindling, and what they've been doing was busing these poor developmentally disabled people who were in Dixon, who were cared for by a staff that understood how to care for developmentally disabled, into nursing homes around Chicago owned by big political contributors. And the big political contributors wanted those patients to fill their beds so they could get the Medicaid funds. And they've been doing that for about 2 years when we discovered, that the population was going down in Dixon. And what they were doing was, at the same time, through another FOI request, we learned that they'd been applying to the Department of Justice to turn Dixon into a prison. So they were installing all these things connected with the prison that you would expect to see, cells and cell doors and fencing and wiring. And so they were slowly converting Dixon into a prison while quietly putting these poor people in these horrible nursing homes. They were some of the worst, but they got them because they were contributing money to the politicians, and nothing was particularly new about that, especially in Chicago. And I found one case that I pursued in the group of hundreds that have been distributed, of a young woman who had been moved into one of the homes, and she had died of bedsore infections, where she had been treated really well in Dixon. Now she was dead. She was in her 20s, early 20s. So I took what I learned from FOIing the information around that case into a story for the Sun-Times, and blew the whole thing open about what the state was doing quietly, converting Dixon into a prison. And these people were dying. And this woman was a good example, this young lady. Her name was Donna Sonnenberg, I remember. And I wrote about her case and the details around her death. And that led to the arrest of, and first conviction, really in Illinois, of a nursing home owner for abuse, criminal abuse. So that was just 2 examples in Chicago, and there were a bunch. When I got back to Arkansas, I came back to do investigations for the 5 daily papers of Waco Media, owned by Walter Hussman, and the Arkansas Democrat at that time, now the Democrat-Gazette. But anyway, I was traveling around the state and doing stories for all the papers and some major investigations into what was going on in Arkansas. One of the cases I got onto was the Marvin Williams case early on. Marvin Williams was a young black man who had died 20 years earlier in Conway in the Faulkner County Jail, arrested by 2 white police officers. And Marvin he was arrested supposedly for being so intoxicated in his car that he couldn't even walk, and they had to carry him. And the 2 officers that testified, let me back up. When I looked at this, I knew that it had been a coroner's inquest. So I FOI'd the coroner's inquest and got about 40 pages of it. And in the inquest, we could see who said what under oath. The 2 officers and others involved in the case at the time of what had happened to Marvin. They said, these 2 police officers, that they had seen Marvin in his car, and it was raining, and he was obviously intoxicated, so they took him in, and in taking him in, they accidentally dropped him. One on each, they had him in the middle, and his arms around each shoulder. and there was a clap of thunder, and all of a sudden he fell forward and hit his forehead. And that's why the pictures later that I also got through FOI, that's how, that was the cause of his death. No, but that wasn't what happened. What really happened was that once they got him in the cell block upstairs, he was seen by a white inmate over across the way being beaten by the two officers, savagely beaten. He was on the floor and they were hitting him and hitting him. Then they dragged him into the woman's cell on the other side. They didn't want to put him in the cell with the men over here, but he was watching this. And it turned out that Marvin was dead the next morning, and an autopsy was done, and the coroner's inquest was impaneled, but they didn't wait for the autopsy results. They ruled that it was an accidental death. By now, though, armed with that, with the coroner's inquest, I started moving ahead, asking other questions, trying to find out everything I could, what happened 20 years, this is 20 years later. I started issuing FOI requests of the medical examiner's office, the coroner's office in Conway, Faulkner County. And anyway, before it was over, I don't know how many stories I wrote using FOI. Bill Clinton, who was governor at the time, the pressure had built so high on all the lies that had been told and exposed that he impaneled, he called for a special prosecutor who impaneled a grand jury. And they called these two officers in. One had become a truck driver since, and the other one was high-ranking in the state police in Arkansas. They left Conway, obviously, and moved on after 20 years. They called them in to testify, and this went on for 3 weeks. The special prosecutor, Gary Isbell from Yellville, he was in a wheelchair, he rolled his wheelchair through the black part of Conway, trying to get people to talk to him and earn their trust so that they could come and testify at the grand jury of what they knew. And before it was over, they indicted those two men for first-degree murder 20 years later. And probably 4 months later, the trial was held. And it was a classic, just about what you'd expect. On one side of the courtroom were blacks praying for justice, and on the other side were whites who were supporting the two police officers. And the testimony was given, and when it was over, they were set free. Well, a lot of truth had emerged during that time, and I had promised the father of Marvin at that time, when I started looking into it, that I wouldn't even open it up unless he gave me his blessing, because I didn't want to open this wound, tear the scab off this 20-year-old injury for them unless they wanted me to, and he had. So it all wrapped up with that exoneration of the two officers. And I might say, too, that as of next week, Ronnie Williams, which Marvin's younger brother, has completed his book on this case called Markham Street. And it's going to be circulated nationwide, and it's going to be in all the Walmart supercenters. And on March 30th at the Clinton Library, Ronnie Williams is reading from his book and doing a book signing. I plan to be down there, too, to be there. His family's now gone, his mom and dad. But without the FOI, I would never have gotten the coroner's inquest and a lot of the other information I was able to get in that case that went on for a year before it finally ended. But I was so discouraged at that point that although I was born here and loved the state, I just wanted to leave because I just had this, it was so obvious what had happened to Marvin, and that this jury all-white jury, had set these men free, that I was offered a job at the Arizona Republic in Phoenix to head their investigative team. So I moved to Phoenix, headed that team. My predecessor there had been murdered with a car bomb 10 years earlier, and they disbanded their investigative team at that time. Now they were reopening it. So they brought me in to reform their investigative unit and start looking into what was going on in Phoenix. And I can tell you Phoenix was about as hardball as Chicago. And one of the first steps that I took there was to FOI all the information around the death of my predecessor, Don Bowles, who'd been murdered with a car bomb at a hotel. The last thing they had from Don Bowles was a note on his desk that he was supposed to meet with a source at a hotel in downtown, the Clarendon Hotel in downtown Phoenix. And he went, but the source never showed up. When he got back in his car, it exploded. So someone had put a bomb under it and killed him. At that time, he'd been looking at land fraud in Arizona, which was rampant. May still be, I don't know. So one of the first things I did was issue FOIAs on everything I could find about the Bowles case. 2 men were later convicted of that. I don't think they ever got to the top, the real people that orchestrated his murder. But Barry Goldwater, at that time was a senator, and he'd endorsed one of these fraudulent land companies that Don Bowles had been looking into. So whether Goldwater had anything to do with it or not, I think if I had to guess or bet the house, I'd say that it went all the way up to his office of what happened to Don to stop him from looking at what he was looking at. But we were able to put a lot more information out about his murder, and 2 men were eventually found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. We did a series on mistreating the American Indians in Arizona. It took us almost a year to do it. And I lost track of how many FOIs we issued, but it enabled us to put together a 32-page special report on how the Indians had been abused in so many ways, from the education to Indian Health Service to slant drilling on their oil drilling on the reservations. And that led to Senate hearings and a lot of changes in the way the Indians were being treated at that time. Joey, give me the sign when it's 30 minutes. Well, is it?
Which sign is that?
That just a wink. Nah, and then we learned about how the elderly of America at that time were being over-medicated and mismedicated to a large degree. Thousands of elderly were being put in nursing homes all around the country and hit in the head with Haldol and Mellaril, 2 really powerful antipsychotics. And what we discovered was, through FOI of the FDA, I can't remember which agency it was, that what was happening was you might admit your grandparent or someone, and they may complain about the food or complain about anything, because lots of times these places were not good places. And so rather than hire another nurse or more staff, they just give them a Haldol pill or a Mellaril and would knock them out. And so at that time, people were going into nursing homes and seeing all these people in wheelchairs with their heads down, and you just think, well, that's a natural state when you get to that age. No, the Haldol was crippling them in every way, but especially mentally. I mean, they're cognitively, they didn't complain anymore, that's for sure. And so that led to about a 28-page special investigation into the mistreatment of the elderly in America. We were fortunate enough in both those cases to be finalists in the Indian case and the elderly abuse, to be finalists for the Pulitzer. We didn't win. We were bridesmaids both days, both years. I guess the point that I wanted to make, Patrick Henry said, the liberties of a people nor were nor ever will be secure when the transactions of their rulers may be concealed from them. And we all know, after just living and listening today, there are lots of people that want to keep out the information, and FOI can make such a huge difference, and it does. It has in my case for 50 years now, and everywhere I've been. And some things I wonder about. I was asking Joey about this in the break, that if you run for office in a free country like this, and you're elected by the public to do their business honorably, respectably, why would you not do it? What happens once you're in office with your group of friends and board members or whoever, or elected officials? Why wouldn't you want to do your job right? I mean, if I was elected, I'd want to do it. And if someone told me to, let's do an end run and keep this quiet, I'd say, I don't want to do that. That's not what I was elected to do. And so, but the question is why? Why in the world would you not want to do the public's business in public? Joey said, well, maybe some of these people that are elected really don't understand the law, and so they just kind of trust their local board attorney to tell them what to do or not do. I think that's true, but I also believe another thing, that some of these people that end up on these boards don't realize that there's pressure involved in it, the decisions you make. Not everybody's going to be happy with your decisions because you're following your own moral code or your own, what you know is right. And so you want to do it in quiet. You want to do it behind the scenes so you don't have to face the pressure. And then all of a sudden someone comes along, issues an FOI request, or the media that's doing their job, and let me emphasize that's doing their job instead of feeling like they're part of the system, starts to ask questions. And then all of a sudden you are embarrassed. You're right in the situation that you wish you'd never gotten into because you didn't do the right thing to begin with. And I have to say that I get disappointed all the time nowadays in my colleagues. When I look around this country and I see the media pretending to be media, but really just apologists and propagandists for a political party, for gosh sakes, why do you sell yourself out, your integrity and your credibility, to please some politicians? Why do you do that? Well, I'm sure there's various reasons, but it's been very disappointing to me of late to see what I have seen and we continue to see in the media, because if they don't hold the dishonorable accountable, who will? Who will? The attorneys. You have good people like Joey who'll sue you. How many Joeys are there? I know one. I look around. How many other? Do you read in the media about any other attorneys in their towns taking on their school board or their board of directors in the city? I don't. And so I hold Joey up in my column, hoping that it will transfer to other attorneys who will say, Joey's doing the right thing. We need to do it here in this town. It may not happen. It hadn't so far, but I'm going to keep plugging. And there's people like Robert Steinbuck, who follows me in just a moment with more detailed legal descriptions of what's going on in this, who also feels the same way. And he stands up for what he believes, rather than caving in to the good old boys or the system, which always has pressure on you and forces you to make a decision. You're going to do what you promised to do, you're going to do what your heart tells you is right, or you're going to cave in and go along. So anyway, this is a brief account of some of the things that I've used the FOI for that have been extremely effective in making change, positive change. And I look forward to hearing what Robert Steinbuck has to say in just a moment. And thanks for listening. I appreciate it.